everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Allyson Shaw to talk about her book, Ashes and Stones, A Scottish Journey in Search of Witches and Witness. Hello, Allyson.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So what's the story behind Ashes and Stones? Why did you want to write this book?
For me, it was a very large puzzle that I wanted to solve. I have been living in Scotland for around 6 years, and one of the first things I was kind of happening upon were these kind of makeshift, kind of modest monuments to women or people killed during the witch hunts. And at the time, I didn't know very much about the scope of the hunts. And over time, I started to delve into it, like, what is this stone? What is this stone? And the more I uncovered in terms of looking at Canmore, the archaeological record, as well as the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, and joining them up, I found women's lives that were humanized by small details or even their own language in the confessions. And I just spent years exploring the landscape and their voices.
So I think it'd be good for listeners to have an idea of when this kind of was, the time frame of this and the extent of it as well, because that's kind of one of the things that shocked me was the amount of persecution against women that was going on during this period.
Yeah, that's right. So it was the late 16th century and into the early 17th century, into the early 18th century. So it went on for many years, many generations. And while the estimates of those who were executed and accused is a rough estimate, because a lot of the paperwork is missing. Sometimes the people's names were not even written down. So around over 2,000 were executed and over 4,000 were accused. And so that kind of gives a scope. At the time, Scotland's population was around 800,000. So, in terms of a ratio, this is significant. And the way the hunts would occur, it was not just a single woman led to the pyre, but groups of people rounded up and systematically. The law was applied to them in a very systematic, and one might even say modern way. So it wasn't, often it's depicted as peasants with pitchforks or, and this was the full force of a very modern idea of the law applied to human beings. So all of that I didn't know about. And I think a lot of people, maybe especially Americans, think Salem must have been quite really bad, right? Because there's the Arthur Miller play, there's so much witch tourism in Salem, and there actually is a very powerful memorial in Salem, but there's only, I think, around 20 accused versus 4,000. So it's a very, very different scope of atrocity in Scotland.
And it was happening wider in Europe as well, wasn't it? That this was going on kind of Europe-wide. But what really interested me was the kind of role of James I / James VI, because often we think of the King James Bible as being central to all sorts of things, education and literacy and all that. But it was kind of used as an excuse, wasn't it, as to why to persecute people?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of heartbreaking because it's such a gorgeous, the language in the Bible, in his translation, is absolutely gorgeous. And he was a poet, but he was also, in my layman historian view, completely paranoid about a demonic conspiracy that was not only bringing an end to his rule, but to the end of the world. And it was his godly vision to stamp out what he saw as demonic activity, which really was a kind of folklore that was shared by many people, not just people who were demonized as witches, but common lore about, you know, sacred springs, you know, things to keep the fairies appeased and stuff were seen suddenly as tools the devil was using to kind of infiltrate the godly society of King James. And I think a lot of people think, oh, it began with North Berwick, and that really was, in terms of psyops, you know, boom, the beginning. But it there were trials before then as well, but that was the most theatrical in
Right.
that the king was there. He was asking Gelly Duncan to play her pipe, whether it was mouth music or pipe song is unclear in the documents, you know, but you know, to perform for him, to perform her witchiness. It's quite a sobering thing to kind of get your head around, that this is how, and then thousands of people died as a result of this kind of staging of a demonic threat, you know.
Yeah, and it kind of coincides with that idea of perhaps Scottish, what would become cities, but larger towns becoming more modern in inverted commas, which pushed against the old folklore, which actually now we are kind of re-embracing, and it's there in ballads and it's there in song and all of these things that we now, you know, look back on as part of being a hugely important part of Scottish culture. But I'm guessing that was then seen as something that was radical in the face of a modern world.
Yeah, and I think that that's another kind of, I think a lot of even neo-pagan people, and there's this witch wave going on. A lot of people, including myself, you know, identify as witches. And what does that mean? What, you know, and can we look back at that lore, or is it opportunistic? There's lots of ethical questions when mining this history for meaning. But at the same time, a lot of the confessions are a storehouse of, you know, not only the authentic voices of these ancestors that were silenced, you know, but what they believed in the land. Like, I live really close to Bin Hill in Rathven, and Androman, I didn't write about, even though 15% of those accused were men, their treatment were so different. I almost feel like it merits a second book, another book. But Androman is fascinating in that he had a kind of relationship with the spirit of that hill that he believed was the queen of the fairies. And he also knew how to kind of rededicate land to this, what he thought were the spirits of the land. That seems very much like a neo-pagan calling of the corners, you know, north, south, east, and west. And so there's these little kernels, glimpses of the relationship these ancestors had with the land. And it's poetic, it's metaphoric, there's some animism, and it captivated me. It was fascinating, even though they're just little shards of what was exploded at the time. So you're looking through almost like shrapnel to find a glimpse of a narrative there.
Well, I was going to ask you about how you approached the research to it, because as you say, a lot of it was inspired by finding these memorials and these stones that were there. And I'm guessing a lot of them, you literally had to find them. They weren't being signposted very well or at all.
Yeah, I mean, often I look, like if there was a place mentioned in the confessions, I would try to find it on an OS map and see where that would take me. But often, I mean, what was one of the most moving discoveries in the journey of the book, which was written in the isolation of the pandemic, and so it was very lonely work. I felt like I was finding almost like these secret messages that other Scottish people had left for each other. Like, do you remember? I remember, you know, and not just current people who maybe will leave a little stone or a flower, but back in history, you know, into the 18th century, there were people who were saying, I'm writing these down because I want to clear their names, or this is more than just a curio of witchcraft. This is a very troubling history. So there were scholars writing those down, and because I didn't have access to the primary sources, I used mostly like 19th century historians who were documenting things from the, the oak gall ink and the rag paper that were written by the notars during interrogation. They transcribed them in their authentic language most of the time, sometimes translated into more modern Scots, but those were the documents that I had to rely on. And it was fascinating to actually be in a dialogue with these 19th century people who wanted us to remember this history, so they were writing them down. And I felt that this wasn't something I was discovering. It was something that people had diligently kind of said, we have to remember this history, even though it's kind of been forgotten. There were little clues all along left for me.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, that there's clues left for future generations to say, okay, we might not be able to examine this at the moment. It's not the time, but hopefully in the future, people like yourself will be able to do it. The book itself, it's kind of part historical investigation, part travelogue, and part memoir, your own stories in it. How do you describe it? How do you think about it as a book?
Yeah, I began it just as kind of a travelogue, and then the history got deeper and deeper. And then I was startled to find, well, things happened while I was writing the book, like my father died, and plus my own struggles with my health and things seemed to be intensely relevant to a book about mourning and outsiderness, and even the way some of the accused were pathologized, had, things happening with their bodies that seemed uncannily similar to things that had happened with my own illnesses. So I also felt that there is a thread of misogyny that I think modern women live with, this inherited hatred that perhaps there is a continuity between what modern women experience and the women who were accused of witchcraft. That's not really a new argument, even suffragists were making this argument. But for me, to kind of drive it home, I felt that to speak from my own point of view as a subject, subjectivity in the face of this dehumanizing force might be an effective argument. I don't know if it is, but that was my hope.
Well, I think it throughout the book, there's this call for greater understanding of people who are not like, the most controlling people, which are still the same, your King James and your King Charles, if you want, there's not a huge, and all of those around them, there's not much different. And that idea that a difference isn't dangerous, and that's what they seem to be saying back in the day, that these people who they deemed as being different, even though they weren't, to their, ideas are different enough that they seemed to be dangerous.
Yeah.
And that still goes on today.
Exactly. The scapegoating of the most vulnerable in society, while those in power who, could, with a snap of a finger, make things better, or whatever, deflecting the woes of the larger culture on the most powerless. I mean, this is something, as you say, it's happening right now. And so it seemed very relevant to examine this moment in history, and even the lens through which there's a kind of a consensus reality that, oh, everyone was just backward. It was an unenlightened time, and we're different now. And I feel like we're not. And I think it's really important to kind of not flatter ourselves in thinking that something like this couldn't happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the approach of writing the book, you say that a lot of it was written during lockdown, but had you, the travelogue side of it, you'd already done, I presume?
A lot of I would return to sites over and over. Sometimes, to my delight, I would see them change, like the Spot Memorial. When I had initially gone, there was an old mistake, like, well, if not mistaken, quite confusing sign that had then been replaced, maybe under the cover of darkness, or by local historians, and Allyson Whiteman and local children made a kind of vibrant, replaced the old confusing memorial with one that was quite sculptural and had insects and plants of the hedgerow surrounding the memorial, and kind words about the souls of the accused. And so sometimes when I would return to a site, I would see it changed, or even the Aberdeen, the beautiful mural in Aberdeen has very recently been vandalized. So sometimes the memorials live on in a new way that's incredibly relevant, and these grassroots movements caring for these monuments and reinventing them so that they're more humane. But then there's also some that are neglected or quite vulnerable to vandalism. And so I would return over and over to these places, and it's true, it began before the pandemic, but then continued on through. I would revisit the places to see if they had changed.
Because that's one of the things I wanted to ask you was about how not just maybe the memorials had changed, but the way people think about them, because some of them seem to have been almost witch trails, come and follow, this is what happened here, and this, and with a slightly salacious and kind of maybe, the way that people would, do that tours of the famous in Hollywood or something like that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that maybe they are changing now, and people are showing more respect, and they're being marked as proper memorials, and to kind of think about what happened there and the people that met their end there.
Yeah, and certainly I think this is a real grassroots movement that communities have come together, most recently in Peebles. But the Kirkwall Memorial in Orkney is incredible in that it was a real collaboration, not only between the archivists like Lucy Gibbon, but the musicians in Orkney, one of the potters, the writers. So it was a real outpouring of creative energy that sought to humanize the women. And I feel like that I look at what happened in Orkney as kind of like, wow. I mean, you also have individuals like the Cashleys in Forfar creating a beautiful memorial, just the two of them doing that. And in a lot of ways, when communities come together in this way, it seems like it's a more effective message than a heritage endeavor that wants it to be a tourist stop or perhaps a money-making scheme. And that excites me, that communities are taking this into their own hands.
Yeah.
And not leaving it up to maybe more cultural bodies to determine what they should say.
And what's interesting, just with what you've said so far already, is it shows you the extent across Scotland that this was happening, because you've mentioned Peebles and North Berwick and Aberdeen and Orkney, and we've not even been to Ayrshire yet, and Rabbie Burns country and all of that stuff. So this really was right across the country that this was happening.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of rich arguments. There's a lot of historical scholarship, which I'm not an academic, but of why perhaps the Highlands were spared, which I don't really go into in the book. And there is one Highland location, but on the whole, this was really widespread and especially concentrated in seaside communities, especially. There is conjecture about, just death at sea being such a real thing for anyone. I mean, I live in Banff, and so everyone here knows someone who lost someone to the sea, it's even now. So that was part of the lore, like don't have a woman on the ship, and even weather working, which might have been a way relatively harmless for a marginalized person to make a bit of coin to sell good winds, suddenly became the enemy of the king himself, right?
Yeah.
So there was a lot of concentration of hunting in seaside communities.
It's that thing almost that we're beginning to understand a little bit more in terms of science and things, and the things we don't understand, we have to find someone to blame. So here's this other group that we're going to blame.
Yeah.
Let's go back into you bringing in some of your own experiences. Was that difficult to do? Was that to kind of look over things that you'd happened to yourself?
Yeah, I think it was probably one of the hardest things I've done. I mean, besides surviving some of those things, to actually make the decision that, well, reading a lot of the more horrific elements of this history were triggering to me. And while I'm not afraid to be triggered, it seemed an opportunity. But I realized that if I were to write about it, it would have to be with a light hand. It would have to be with a humility, to contextualize my own journey with the more horrific history, the kind of like the lynching in Pittenweem and things like that. There's no comparison, and yet I felt a link to what they had experienced on the run, being hunted.
And you think you were always going to bring them in, or was that maybe a result of the time spent writing in lockdown and reflection and all of those things?
That's such a wonderful, perceptive question. I hadn't even thought about it till you said that I do think that in isolation, right, sometimes not even being able, I wanted to travel to a location, I would have to make sure that I could go because of the zoning, and not seeing anyone, for unless they were the size of a postage stamp like we are, not seeing anyone for years. So you're alone with your past.
Yeah.
And I think that became a really immediate reckoning in that space of the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. And the subtitle of the book is In Search of Witches and Witness. And witness seems to be central to the book, that kind of importance of acknowledgement, remembrance, and giving voice to those who were persecuted. Do you think that is happening now? Is there still much to do?
I think there's so much to do. It is happening.
Yeah.
And it is happening. And there's, even within the government, and Nicola Sturgeon's historic apology means so much to not only recognizing this history, but women who have survived violence, either at the hands of the state or people they knew or strangers. And I think that it's just beginning, but there's also a competing thread of this witch wave is like a cash cow. So these are at odds. the the wanting to memorialize and give dignity to the dead, and then let's make some money. Witches are hot, let's make some money. And because there's some real tension there. There needs to be so much more discussion before the kind of profit driven narrative wins out.
It is, isn't it? It's difficult, because it seems that always comes in at some point, that someone's looking for a way to, how can we make money out of this?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, over the last couple of years, and particularly the year coming, people talk about witch fiction in inverted commas, and there's going to be so many books of fiction being written. Now, some of them I'm sure will be fantastic, but some of them may not be so good. What's your thoughts on that side of things?
Well, I think one of the downsides of writing this history is I could no longer indulge in these fantasies, which I think at one time I really enjoyed. Witchy books and witchy things. It was fun, and the aesthetic was really fascinating. And I can no longer, there's too much dissonance where I'm like, that's not how it was. That's not what it is. Or, so I don't know if I will come around to that. And I guess what one nuts and bolts thing is, I would love to see an end to this indulging in the pyre. Really loving this moment of screaming hysteria around the fire where the woman is shouting something or whatever, and just that cliched trope. It's just, it's so toxic. And so it's relied upon as a dramatic hinge in so much witch fiction. And I think it really does a disservice. Well, in Scotland, women were not burnt alive. They were strangled and then burned. Now, that didn't always work out. But, I think, or sometimes this idea that women were hung, that happened in a different context and mostly in England. But this kind of fetishizing the moment of execution, is really sickening.
I think just even, the facts, as you set them out, that what happened in Scotland was this: people were hung and then burned. That's so brutal and so straight, and it's in the book a lot. And I think that's one of the great things it does. It's like, no, you can't mess around with what happened here, and it also made me think about the way, certainly I was brought up with the idea of witches, which were, caricature, Halloween, witch, skeleton, whatever. That was kind of it. And everyone knew what it was, going back to the Wizard of Oz and all of those kind of ideals, which, as you say, really in the modern day aren't helpful at all. Yeah.
There might be some truth to it. Like, the mole on her face is the mark that was pricked.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That was this, just a little freckle that, was this demonic place that was actually, punctured, through torture. Or the bruises on her face were green from, old bruises changing the color of her face. So this caricature actually has marks of torture in it. When we think about it that way, it becomes really disturbing that this is kind of ushered out at Halloween for entertainment for children. And this is the story we're telling children about this history. It seems so wrong to me that we're framing these helpless women executed by the state as monsters,
And something, when you say executed by the state, and was it state, or was there, who exactly were doing the hunting, put it that way? Was it the church? Was it the state? Was it a mixture of both?
It was landowners and the church working together. I think certainly around the reign of King James, there were people wanting to curry favor. So if we can serve up a witch, like if we can look like good witch hunters, then he'll know we're up for the godly society. So it was a power play. But really, the men that sat in judgment were landed nobles, and things went down in the church court unless they were in Edinburgh, which was actually the government.
And you know what struck me about the book right through it was, and again happening today, right today, is the persecution of groups. And as you say, offering one up as often saying, look at this person. This then goes to all of these people who we have grouped together, and that just leads to greater persecution across the board. And it's, you know, as I say, it's happening right now in all sorts of ways. And did you find that the more you did the research into the past, that you were seeing these parallels with today?
Yeah, and I think certainly I spent a lot of time looking at what the women said and kind of trying to read a moment that seemed authentic rather than words that were being fed to her, but something of her own life. But there's been lots of amazing scholarship from Julian Goodare and others that actually really examined witch hunters. And I wasn't interested in that. But certainly you have profiles of like Weinstein-like creeps, and men who were really using these women cynically as like kind of pawns in a play to gain more power, gain more political favor, or they were religious zealots who really believed they were, I mean, and this, I'm not excusing it by saying this, but believed that they had to stamp out Satan in their midst, and that meant Satan lived in these older women, help the poorest, most elderly women in their congregation were the embodiment of Satan, which is, you know, really, really strange.
But it's that idea of, well, who do you go for? You go for the weakest in society because that's the easiest thing to do. And unfortunately, again, that's something that we can see today. And you mentioned Nicola Sturgeon's formal apology to those accused of witchcraft during the witch hunts. I think it was in 2022, so recent apology. You said it was an important thing. Why was it such an important thing for her to do?
Well, I think one aspect that was important to me is that it showed Scotland as a country that's willing to look at its own past and say, we are now going forward. We are looking at this clearly. We're not going to ignore it, right? And we are going to invent a modern Scotland where this never happens again, you know? But also, it meant a lot. It was a risk, right? I mean, you could even see people ridiculing her, you know, what is this Monty Python? And like all this, you know, her genuine apology that was so articulate. And it was, she really honed in on that this happened because of misogyny. And so all women who are survivors, and there's so many of us who have survived violence, heard that. Heard that and felt, I mean, this is a cliche to say, but felt seen, right? And so no matter how she was ridiculed, the fact that she had the courage to do this had political ramifications in terms of Scottish identity for me, national identity, but also personally, as someone who has survived misogynist violence, it felt necessary.
And talking about Scotland, you travelled around Scotland. Were you surprised by anything? Did it change your perception of the place and its people when you were going so far and wide?
Yeah, I think there was often quite a bit of dissonance, like, because Scotland is so beautiful and I'm an immigrant, but it's home to me. It's like my soul sings here. And yet here I was going to places that were confounding. And often people were telling me stories that were like really crazy, you know, sensationalist versions of whatever, you know, like kind of folky that were really disturbing. Or people had no idea. And that's what was really shocking when I was kind of telling people, oh, I'm doing this. They're like, what? But Salem was much worse, right? Or people didn't know about this history. And that shocked me, because I thought, well, I just don't know, because I didn't go to school here. You know, I didn't learn about Scottish history till I moved here, and I did, you know, just read everything I could. But it shocked me to know that this wasn't taught in school, so Scottish people didn't know about it.
As someone who went through that school system, yeah, we didn't really learn much about Scottish history at all. It was all kind of British history, and so much of it that I only learnt when I went to university to study literature, you know, and then suddenly all this other stuff came through. So it doesn't surprise me that that's the kind of reaction that you might have. And it also doesn't surprise me that you may get people giving you kind of lurid stories, because they probably think that's what you want to hear, because it goes back to that idea of which trails rather than anything else, and saying, oh, guess what happened here, and then they up how bad it was by however much.
Yeah, exactly. And so but I do think when I would find these like little stones or more modern plaque, it was a startling like affirmation, you know, like I felt even in my solitary kind of, that I am an immigrant in a rural area, and during lockdowns, you know, so not seeing anyone, there were these moments of like community, even though no one was around. I felt that I was part of a group of Scottish people who were looking at this history in the same way, bearing witness to it. It was quite moving and powerful to see.
Sorry, I was going to say, if people are listening to this and would like to find and take a look at these places for themselves, are they quite easy to discover? Is there online places that they can go and discover them?
I mean, certainly my book is a good like a good, you know, guide. Yeah, but I think actually one thing people can do is consult. Now, this wouldn't lead to monuments, but it would lead to their kind of ancestral neighbors. There's a map that's part of the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft, put out by the University of Edinburgh. And it's an interactive map. So you can look at the part of Scotland that you live in or you're from and zero in on it. And as the map expands, there are little figures that are actually taken from News from Scotland, the pamphlet.
All
so
right.
the little figures that multiply, and each one has a name. And when you click on her or him, it will take you to, you know, their trial date, any details that are known, and the place like the Privy Council records or whatever, where you could refer to find even more information. This was really helpful for me in writing the book. But people could also use it, like if they wanted to do their own memorial locally, they could find the names.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but certainly what's been uncovered to date. That would be, it's an incredible starting point to find local information.
And I should say, at the start of your book, there is a fantastic map
Yeah.
people can see on the video version, which does have the names and the places where people can go to see. And actually, I'm just looking at it, and it is interesting that it's more often than not East Coast that the places are.
And certainly it's not an exhaustive
no.
list. I mean, I was realizing as the book was being finalized that more memorials were being built. I was discovering more Carlin stones, right? I mean, it's potentially infinite.
Well, that leads me on to my next question, was, do you feel this investigation has ended for you, or do you think this is just the beginning?
I mean, it feels like the beginning. I'm totally fascinated actually by Orkney and Shetland and how different the witch trials were there, and how much Norse folklore. It has a very different character. So instead of fairy lore, you know, you have trolls and troll cats and troll women, and you know, so, and it's quite vibrant. And even the kind of Norwegian law being kind of butting up against Scottish law right at this time
Right.
is really fascinating stuff.
Oh, that sounds amazing, because that, you know, the art and the literature from that part of the world is often very different, you know, to what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah.
Allyson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really love the book. It's a terrific read, and it's been so nice to be able to talk to you about it.
It's been just wonderful. Thank you so much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.